Okay, Lieutenant Colonel Perez here for another episode of Arguing the OE. We've taken a break for 2-3 months, but we're ready to get started. What I'm going to do today is introduce a series of 4 episodes that are going to be airing next. And these episodes are going to highlight students from my seminar. It's a scholar seminar at Fort Leavenworth entitled The Local Dynamics of War seminar. And these students are engaged in a project where they're trying to understand how lethal power mixes with governance, politics, economics, civil society, identity, culture, and ethical factors. And all of these factors get tangled up in order to create tough problems for us in our areas of operation, in our joint operational areas, in our areas of responsibility. So that's the project of LDW, Local Dynamics of War. Let me briefly describe what the students have done so far and in order to give you some context. The very first thing that we realize is that our business entails such things as strategies, campaign plans, operations orders, and mission statements. And if you really look at these things closely and you study them, you realize that these written statements are nothing more than causal arguments. They're causal stories that describe why things are going on the way they are in a certain area. And if we intervene with our troops, our speech, our resources, and our unified action relationships, we think we can nudge that state of affairs towards a more desirable state of affairs. So we're always talking in our profession about causality. The problem we identify is that we're not really explicit about causation in our business. So what we'll see is we'll put up a line of effort, right, that's supposed to achieve a certain condition. When you add up all these different conditions, you get your end state. We'll put objectives or decisive points or tasks along this line of effort, but we won't really give a causal story as to why we think the accomplishment of a certain objective or decisive point or task will actually help achieve a desired state of affairs. And so what we do in LDW is try to sort through this. Our students in LDW get a taste of philosophy of science. And the philosophy of science approach that we take is one that's introduced by Ian Shapiro, a professor at Yale University. And what he emphasizes is an approach called critical realism. And central to this is understanding that good science is not simply describing the association between, say, 2 variables, x and y. That as x rises, y falls, or as x rises, y increases also. That's not enough for what we do when we're trying to be attentive to causation and giving causal stories. What we need are stories that link why it is that as one variable alters, say x, another variable alters as well, y. And this right here is something that we call a causal mechanism within critical realism. We believe that causal mechanisms are real things in the world, but we also believe that they're contestable and that we can argue about them. And so what we do is we study Ian Shapiro to get an approach of the importance of causal mechanisms within the context of doing work that is based on real-world problems. Okay. So the next thing we do is we read Craig Parsons. And Craig Parsons has a book, How to Map Arguments in Political Science. And what he argues is that within life, within the sciences, within the social sciences, there are only 4 types of causal stories you can tell, causal logics. And these are, and I'll spell them out here, structural, institutional, ideational, and psychological. And with each of these, you have an element that goes along with it. And that becomes important here in a little bit. So structural elements are things that are, in most cases, not man-made. They're non-manipulable. Things like the weather, like terrain, like the distribution of natural resources in the earth, etc. Institutional elements are things that are man-made. They're organizations and institutions. Here, institutions mean a set of rules by which we organize our activities, right? Ideational elements are, in the profession of arms, usually associated with things like culture. But they're the stories that people tell the ideas, the symbols that people have that give meaning to their lives, to their activities, to their professions, to what they do. And then psychological elements are hardwired psychological mechanisms of the kind that Dan Kahneman talks about in his popular book, Thinking Fast and Slow, or that Dan Ariely talks about when he's talking about cognitive illusions. They're the heuristics and biases that really plague our thinking. So there's 4 types of causal elements, and what happens is they impart causal spin in different parts of the world. So we can say that structural elements impart a structural causal logic. So when we say things like that, in a very simplified way, that mountainous terrain or difficult terrain like you find in an archipelago, that these are conducive to, they conduce to, say, rebellion or insurgencies, then you're making a structural argument about why rebellion might be occurring in one place or is more likely to occur in one place than another. Now, institutional elements are interesting because they can either operate as structures in the environment that cause us to move one way or the other, or they can operate in terms of an institutional causal logic, which means that we make certain decisions at a certain point in time that constrains our behavior and has unintended effects later on. And an example that I like to give for my students of institutional causal logic at play is this arrangement that when you deploy to a danger area, you can collect danger pay for 2 months so long as your travel straddles 2 months. Say you leave at the end of May, say 29 May, and you come back on 3 June. Well, you automatically get tax benefits and collect danger pay for 2 months. Now, that imparts a perverse incentive on people. So what happens is, if you have a choice about when to take your leave, you have or when to go to a danger area, you'll choose a time frame that straddles those two. It's not the right thing to do. You could say that it's ethically problematic, but we set up our rules in such a way that people would take advantage of it. And so this is what we would call an institutional causal logic. An ideational element is, say, somebody acts because of a certain ideology, whether it's communism or nationalism, or they act, say, out of a religious impulse, say, of Hinduism, Buddhism, or Christianity, or they act out of some version of secularity or an atheism. When they act for these ideas or symbols, then we say that there's an ideational causal logic. Right? And then we have psychological elements, which impart a psychological causal logic. And so an example of this would be these heuristics and biases that plague us. But say that we're trying to make a decision about what's going on in a certain area. And we see something similar going on in it. We saw something similar go on in an area not too far away about a year ago. Say in the Arab Spring. We see a rebellion in one country and it plays out in a certain way. Well, we'll look at that and we'll automatically assume that what's going to happen in this area a year later is going to play out the same way. Okay? So that's a certain bias that all human persons have, regardless of where they live or what time they live, whether it's 3 centuries ago, whether it's today, whether it's in the future. Psychological biases plague all people at the same time. Okay, so they learn how to analyze different causal arguments according to these causal logics. And it automatically brings rigor. So when they make an assertion, people can challenge them and say, okay, what exactly are you saying is going on in your story? But the problem is that these are all what I call independent, dependent variable, or for short, IVDV type arguments. That it's taking the complexity that exists, where all things are tangled, and it's saying that there's a relation between this and this, and it's leaving everything else, for the most part, constant. Ceteris paribus, it would be the term. The problem is that the world doesn't look like that. Right? We know that the world is composed of different systems, and they each touch upon each other and influence each other. So for that reason, we read Craig Parsons, but we supplement our reading of him with someone else whom we read, William Connolly. And William Connolly is a political theorist at Johns Hopkins, and what he does, and what he's been doing recently in the past couple of books, is introducing complexity science into the social sciences, into social and political life. So what William Connolly does then is he allows us to appreciate that each of these elements really is a system. And he calls these things as open systems or force fields. So an open system could be a person. An open system could also be, say, a religion or a view of secularity. An open system could be a climate or terrain. It could also be a disease, say alcoholism. Or it could be a virus that could potentially spread from a bird to human persons. He looks at the world in terms of open systems that each self-organize and morph on their own. But what happens is that they touch, right? They each influence each other. Sometimes they collide, sometimes they imbricate or overlap. Sometimes one is infused into another. And oftentimes what you have when these things influence each other is creativity. So what William Connolly allows us to do is appreciate the complexity in the technical sense of the way that these different causal elements play out. And what we find is that really unpredictability and uncertainty is a hallmark of social and political life, of which war is a part. And we as military professionals who operate in those realms of war, of political life, of social life, we need to come to grips with that. So that when we choose to intervene in a complex environment, we're not surprised when surprise occurs in that environment. So what you're going to see now are 4 episodes by the students where they're going to use technical jargon. They're going to use these terms in a technical way on purpose. The 4 briefings are not intended to be really briefings to inform the broader public, but they are a way for me to evaluate, to assess that the students have a good understanding of both Craig Parsons and William Connolly. But I think it's worth putting them up on the website, Arguing the OE, because it allows other people to see how it is that military professionals who are attentive to what social science and political science can bring to the table, the fruits that it can yield. And so you're going to see 2 examples of these ideas applied with respect to Iraq, and you're going to see a 3rd applied with respect to Afghanistan, and then finally a 4th applied to the current conflict in Syria. And I think you'll find them interesting. You'll see some of the question and answer play out for some of these. For others you won't. Don't assume that the applications that the students have in these exercises are always 100% correct. I'm able to assess that later on and correct them. But I think it's interesting for you, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks.